Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month we're going to do things a little bit differently, and I'm going to work on one finished piece and divide the classes into painting a background and painting the people in the foreground. So the first step is preparing your working space, and I've done all of that. I stretched my paper and stapled it down to a sturdy board, and then I very carefully graphed out my portrait. So I put borders on the photograph that I'm working off of, gave myself some measurements, so the dead center vertically and horizontally, and then some notches in between those, making sure that they're the same from one side to the other. And then I translated the proportions and the notches to my watercolor paper and laid out the drawing using these grid points as references. The next step is to get the photograph enlarged so that I have really good clear color and good clear guidelines for the lines. Now, just one thing before we begin. This isn't the only way to paint, but for this tutorial I want to show you how to go about things if you want your finished piece to be really tight and realistic. After drawing the picture really carefully, I took some masking fluid and just here and there masked out some of those highlights that would be difficult to paint around. So let's begin. Working from back to the front, the farthest thing in the background is the leaves. So I paint down a little swatch. I decide whether or not it's close enough to the color that I want. I make adjustments if needed. Paint down another swatch right by the hole. And when I've decided that it is the color that I'm looking for, obviously that's the color that I'm going to use to paint from. So I'm going to paint these leaves. I'm trying to visualize the shape of the color of the leaves and then put them in as large pieces. And I'll mix in a couple of different colors of green as I work so that the colors will just really nicely and naturally bleed together. I don't want to drive myself crazy, and so I'm not, even in a really tight style, going to try to copy every leaf. All I need is the impression of leaves. If I get too detaily with the background, it's going to pull interest away from the foreground, and all of a sudden I'll have an excellent painting of leaves with two people distracting the attention away. This is supposed to be a portrait, so remember, don't put the cart before the horse. I'm still using the photo as a really strong guide. I'm just not copying every single little leaf. So I'm going to work this way, finish up the leaves, and come back to you. When the leaves are in place, I'm going to add these little branches. I'm going to do that by matching that brown first. So even with something that seems fairly insignificant, I'm going to take my time and carefully match the color. I've already left some space for them in places, but I'm just going to carefully go. And when you're doing things that require rigor, that also means that you should be using one stroke whenever possible. That's the process that I'll use to put in all of those twigs. So I'll do most of that twig work off camera. Let's move to the bushes now. So that's going to be really similar to the leaves, it's just a different shade of green. I'm going to grab a flat, get it wet, mix up that green. I'm just using the brush on the side, carefully going all the way up to the tree trunk, avoiding this branch, and then that green goes about to here, and then it softens into some different shades. So while this dark is on my brush, I'm going to put in everything that I see that needs to be this color first. Okay? So you see how I'm just going on my merry way here and avoiding those leaves that I already painted. So I'm going to finish up this darker green off camera. The green is going to go right down to here, and then there's some little light patches, things like that I'll need to work around. But you've seen the technique that I'll be using, so now it's just a matter of putting in the time, finishing up the twigs and the bushes, and then I'll come back and we'll push forward a little bit more with the background. Now everything except the grass and the big tree here is done. Laying in those green patches of grass in the foreground is just exactly what you'd expect. It's just a matter of matching the green that you see in the photo reference and then laying down those blocks of color as smoothly as you can, which means using a flat. So I'm using a large flat here, and I'm just using it on the side for the more angular patches of grass where the grass is more light struck. The green might change color, or it might be a watered down, less intense version of the same color, but I like to change from one shade to the next without ever washing out my brush or letting those colors dry in between so that they're mixing on the page. Don't consider any area of your painting insignificant. It's all part of the organic whole, so this square inch is no more important than the square inch on one of the people's face. So the grass is not just something to get through, it's an important part of your painting. And then there's a shadow being cast on the road. So I start with my fiddly little shapes, the small lines being cast in that shadow, and then before it has a chance to dry, I sweep through the larger shapes and I make them all smooth by using my large brush. I put them down once and leave them alone to make them look intentional. Okay, now we're ready to let that dry and then do final touch-up and then move to the tree. It's going to take a lot of work to make this tree look like the tree in the photograph. I've taken some time and drawn some of the more obvious texture. So I'm going to start painting the tree by painting those lines of really dark pattern in between the rough bits of bark. The best way to go about it is by giving yourself a guideline in the pencil first and then going back and carefully painting those lines. And I don't have even, precise lines. They're thick and thin. So I'm going to go off camera, finish this line work, and then I'll come back and show you what step 2 is. Now those dark lines are all in place, and you can see from looking at the reference material that there are two basic colors other than those dark lines. There's this reddish brown of the underbark, and then this greenish gray color of the bark itself, and sometimes that gray goes more light and looks almost white. And so I'm looking for the largest areas of those two basic colors with the idea that I can put them down in large blocks and then from there do more modifications to make them more precisely correct for whatever area. I'm going to go in on the side like this. Notice how I'm going right over the top of those dark lines. Now one trick with going over dark lines that you've already put in place, pretty much you can only do that once and then you're going to start to wash them away. So try to keep your color to a one-time application over the top. And see, now I'm going in with some variations, some different reds, some different browns, and I'm going to give it a little bit more life that way. Now when I want to start moving to the bark, it has to be quite substantially different or it's not going to read as a different texture. You know, it's not quite getting there. I'm going to try sponging it on. So I'll sponge this texture on first. Alright, that's pretty good. So now I'll go back with my brown and I'll start to do some of the delicate detail work of adding the brown around that bark. It's going to go just like this, so I go slowly up next to the fine details, the hair and things like that, and then I go faster in the areas where I can. Okay, I'm going to go off camera now and finish this up, working the way that you see me doing now, and I'll come back when that tree is done. When you've finished all of that tedious work in the tree, it might look something like this. Now, a few things for when you're finishing up detail and bark. There's so many layers that sometimes the easiest thing to do is you start with those dark lines in between and then you paint the major patches of color that you see. Then I let that dry, use your flat shader, and just pick out little details here and there. See how I can rub and lift a tiny lip on some of the edges of bark? It looks like absolutely nothing has changed, but taking that all together at the very end, it's really going to add realism. And then do a lot of stepping back from the painting and squinting and seeing how the relative lights and darks are adding up. So here there's a problem. This doesn't look like a sunlit patch on the tree. The patches themselves are light enough, but the surrounding tree is not dark enough. So in order to bump up the contrast, I'm going to get a flat brush, wet, and then just carefully add a darker layer here and there. And already that patch is springing out. And again, you do that, you find those places by stepping back from the painting, squinting at your reference material, and seeing how the relative lights and darks are comparing between the reference material and your painting. So that concludes our tutorial on painting a background. In the next tutorial we're going to push forward and we're going to work on the clothing and the faces of the two people standing in front of the trees here. So let's push forward now and do that.